Thunder cracked, waking Elena from the nightmare she was having. She gasped and sat up in bed, trying to catch her breath and fight away the impending feeling of doom, even as the dream faded from her mind. Still, the image of something dark and evil lingered in her half-conscious state. Insistent knocking coming from down the hall made her nearly jump out of her skin. Quickly, she realized it was the front door. Rubbing her eyes, she picked up her cell phone to check the time. Sighing, she knew there was only one person that would knock at her door at 3 a.m. She was just glad her parents were away on work again. She slipped out of bed and cringed at how cold her wood floors were. Forgoing her robe, she walked into her living room in nothing but boy shorts and a long-sleeve sleep shirt. It was going to get messy anyway, and she didn't feel like ruining another pair of her good clothes. She flipped the latch and peeked out, only to confirm her gut feeling. There, soaking wet on her porch, leaving a sizable puddle, was none other than Reagan Kane, her best friend. Her white hair was luminescent in the night's darkness, and she waved awkwardly. "Hey." Her soft husky voice always sent a thrill down Elena's spine, and she held it back as well as the urge to blush while she opened her door wider and motioned for the woman to come in. Elena closed the door and redid the latch before turning to her friend, a curse word on the tip of her tongue, only to pause when her eyes caught the color of the liquid that had been dripping from Reagan. It was a pink swirl of red diluted by the rain. "You're hurt." Her voice was a short tisk, as this wasn't the first time, nor, she suspected, would it be the last, that this woman came to her injured. Reagan chuckled softly and shrugged, grimacing as her hand flew back up to her side. It had dropped when she entered, as if she were trying to hide her obvious discomfort. "Yeah, it was a lucky hit. You should see the other guy." She was cut off when Elena held up her hand, her glare fierce and threatening. "Go sit in the kitchen." Reagan nodded and hobbled down the familiar path. Elena took a moment, taking a deep breath to still the shake in her hands that always appeared when Reagan came to her like this. She reached up and rubbed the small coin on the silver chain around her neck almost absently, a nervous tick of sorts, that gave comfort and helped her center her thoughts. Then she made her way to the bathroom, where she kept a fully stocked first aid kit. Sewing kit and burn wound cream included. It depressed her sometimes that she knew so much about how to patch someone up, from binding broken ribs to sewing chopped off body parts back on. Most were only possible because of what she and Reagan were. Had they been human, Reagan would have been dead 10 times over. But alas, Reagan and Elena were something more, and Elena was even more still. They were werewolves. Not only that, but by some humorous twist of fate, Elena and Reagan were werewolves from rival clans. Elena from the long-dead Fallons, while Reagan hailed from the MacLeods, though she relinquished that name long ago for various reasons, most importantly being her survival. Their friendship was a complicated one, but Elena wouldn't trade it for the world. "What happened?" she asked softly as she came back into the kitchen and placed the first aid kit on the wooden island Reagan had pulled up a chair next to. "Knife wound to my left side. I think I have a dislocated right shoulder, but I'm not sure." Elena reached up and slapped the shoulder, making Reagan grunt and whine slightly, only to clear her throat. "Yep, definitely dislocated." Elena nodded and set about pulling out gauze in the sewing kit that had stitched her friend back up more times than it had ever done so to any clothing. She pulled out the ice pack that snapped to get cold, and ointment for the wound. When she turned back to her patient, she held back a blush as well as a wince. Reagan had managed to take off her shirt and was poking one bruise covering her shoulder. It concerned them for a while. Though Reagan was a werewolf, she didn't heal as fast as most. Such a wound for Elena would have healed almost instantly, but for Reagan, it would take a few days. She healed much faster than a human, so at least there were some small blessings. Reagan was also extremely beautiful. Like, undeniably beautiful. Her hair was white, like fresh powdered snow. It had always been white for some mysterious reason, though Elena knew nothing of her heritage besides the clan she came from. Her eyes were such a deep and profound green that Elena often wondered if she was looking into an abyss. They had a way of sucking you into them with promises of secrets. And Reagan was a woman with numerous secrets. She was pale and soft and just wonderful. Elena cleared her throat to halt her train of thought as she focused on the knife wound. A lucky shot indeed. It looked like a clean cut and would be easy enough to stitch back up, and Reagan's healing abilities would handle the rest. Elena nodded and decided on the order of things. "I'll reset your shoulder first." Reagan nodded and held her bad shoulder at the elbow. Elena moved behind her, and with a sudden movement and a resounding pop, followed by a soft groan, Reagan's shoulder was fine. Elena reached over to the counter and picked up the small ice pack, handing it to Reagan, who immediately held it to her shoulder as Elena set about cleaning the knife wound. As she used a washcloth to clean out the dirt and blood from the wound, her mind completely focused on the task. Reagan regained her breathing, and Elena faltered only when she felt gentle fingers combing through her midnight tresses. If Reagan was light and soft edges, then Elena was all dark and hard angles. They held more differences than similarities, and yet they would die for each other if past actions were anything to go by. She glanced up from her work. "Your hair's messy," Reagan stated, her eyes half-lidded and her smile lazy. Elena rolled her eyes and went back to work, trying to hold back another blush. "That's what happens when you wake someone up in the middle of the night. It's early morning. Whatever." Those gentle fingers moved to cup her chin and raised her head again so those intense green eyes could focus in on her blue ones. "You had another nightmare." It wasn't a question, and Elena sighed but didn't deny it. "Tell me about it." Elena shook her off and finished putting on the gauze. "It's nothing, Ray," she said, and moved away, only for a warm hand to catch hers. Reagan's hands were always hot. Reagan had always run a bit hotter than most werewolves because of her curse. "Hey." Elena met her gaze again and shuddered at the intensity. "It matters to me. Anything with you always matters to me. Let me care about you." Elena nodded and held Reagan's hand tighter, helping pull her to her feet. It was always disarming how Reagan could push past her barriers. Elena was used to being independent and dealing with her problems on her own. Her mothers were fiercely independent and a force to be reckoned with in their own right. They had instilled the ethic of, if you can't figure it out for yourself, you're not trying hard enough. Approach it from a different angle. Don't follow the lines already there. Start drawing your own lines to get the results you want. It was the kind of mentality Elena had lived by for as long as she could remember. Elena was an alpha. She had been groomed to lead one day, and had been given everything she would need to succeed. She was trained to fight, put in the best schools. She had special training since her wolf had manifested at 5 years old, and one thing Elena never did was fail. This meant she rarely relied on others. Reagan had been challenging her to trust her, if no one else, and Elena learned that this type of caring was intoxicating and addicting. "I'll make tea, then we can go into the living room," Elena said. "Okay." Elena cleaned up the blood that had ruined her shirt, changed her clothes into something warm and comfortable, and washed the kitchen and blood trail Reagan had left behind before getting out the things she needed to make 2 cups of jasmine tea. They were quiet while they waited for the water to boil, but once the tea was poured, they settled comfortably in the living room. Reagan sipped at her drink before looking around. There were Halloween decorations up. Little pumpkins littered the tables, and spiders and different types of stones surrounded small cauldrons. Elena lived in an old house. It was the house her parents had settled into when Elena was around 7, if Reagan remembered right. The house was set back from a heavily wooded area and just a ways off from the nearest werewolf clan, the Landers clan. Reagan also remembered that Ramus Lander had given the land to Kate, one of Elena's moms, after they helped him with something important so many years ago. I like what you've done with the place. Elena shrugged and warmed her hands on her mug. I was bored. Reagan nodded, set down her mug, and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small white box. She held it out to Elena, who held back her shock and set down her cup, reaching out to take it. You remembered. I never forget. Happy 21st, Elena. Elena opened the small box and held back a gasp. It goes with your necklace. Elena reached down and touched the small silver trinket around her neck. The necklace had been a gift from her mother, Snow. It was called a saint pot, and it was covered in strange symbols that Elena did not understand the meaning of. The saint pot had a special power, but Elena for the life of her couldn't remember what it was. Yet she'd always felt a strong need to wear it. It was no surprise that Reagan noticed it as they spent so much time together. Inside the box was a small white gold band. Engraved into it, in gold, were tiny symbols that matched those of the saint pot. It was the script on the inside of the band that made Elena pause and tears spring to her eyes. Engraved there were the words, heart for a heart, soul for a soul. I hope it's not too cheesy. I just wanted to get you something nice. It's fine if you don't like it. Elena looked up to see Reagan blushing. She threw herself at the woman and wrapped her in a big hug. The sudden flinch reminded her that Reagan had come to her injured. She tried to pull back, but Reagan held her tighter. It's fine. But it's fine, just for a minute. Elena nodded into her neck and held her tighter, surrounding herself with the warm, spicy scent of something smoky and something dangerous. When they sat back, Reagan smiled. You like it? Elena held out her hand and the ring. Put it on me, please. Reagan laughed and took the ring. Her hand was warm as she held Elena's, and the band was cool until it slotted perfectly past the knuckle of her ring finger. Suddenly the band grew warm, and the necklace around Elena's neck responded by heating up. Elena felt a shudder travel from her finger to her neck as something heavy settled deep within her chest. It felt like something unbreakable, like a promise.